people, the global economy feels invisible. You wake up, fuel prices change slightly, groceries become a little more expensive, flights cost more than usual, and life moves on. But behind all of that is an enormous machine quietly powering the modern world every single day. Massive cargo ships crossing oceans, oil tankers transporting energy between continents, supply chains moving food, fuel, electronics, chemicals, medicine, and raw materials across the planet with incredible precision. And the terrifying part is that much of this giant system depends on a handful of narrow choke points most people have never even thought about. One of the most important is the Strait of Hormuz, a tiny stretch of water so strategically critical that experts often describe it as the beating heart of the global energy system. Every single day, enormous volumes of oil and liquefied natural gas flow through this narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. Entire economies depend on it functioning smoothly. Factories depend on it. Airlines depend on it. Financial markets depend on it. Governments depend on it. And according to some experts, if this single choke point were ever fully disrupted for a prolonged period of time, the economic consequences could be unlike anything the modern world has experienced in decades. That's exactly the terrifying scenario many analysts are now discussing. Energy historian Daniel Yergin described the potential disruption as possibly more significant than the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979, events that triggered inflation, economic instability, and massive geopolitical consequences around the world. And when you begin understanding how interconnected the global economy truly is, you start realizing why this threat matters so much. Because modern civilization doesn't simply run on energy. It runs on cheap, stable, predictable energy flowing continuously through highly optimized global systems. The second that flow becomes unstable, the ripple effects spread everywhere. Imagine millions of barrels of oil suddenly struggling to reach global markets efficiently. Countries that rely heavily on imported energy begin feeling pressure almost immediately. Nations across Asia become especially vulnerable because enormous percentages of their oil and LNG imports travel directly through the Strait of Hormuz. South Korea, Japan, China, Thailand, India, these are giant industrial economies deeply dependent on energy imports. Factories need electricity. Transportation systems need fuel. Chemical plants need natural gas. Entire economies require constant energy flow just to maintain normal daily activity. Once disruption begins, governments are suddenly forced into emergency planning. Fuel rationing discussions emerge. Strategic reserves become critically important. Businesses begin panicking about supply shortages. And financial markets immediately react because investors understand one uncomfortable truth. Energy is not just another commodity. Energy is the foundation beneath the entire economic system. That's why oil shocks are so dangerous. Rising energy prices don't stay isolated inside gas stations. They spread outward into almost every sector of the economy like shockwaves. Transportation becomes more expensive. Manufacturing becomes more expensive. Food production becomes more expensive. Shipping becomes more expensive. Airline operations become more expensive. Fertilizer production becomes dramatically more expensive. Suddenly inflation starts spreading everywhere at once because energy sits underneath almost every modern product and service people use daily. And this is where things become truly dangerous for the global economy. Inflation behaves differently when it's driven by energy disruptions. Central banks can sometimes manage demand-driven inflation by raising interest rates. But supply-side inflation caused by geopolitical disruptions becomes much harder to control. You cannot simply print more oil. You cannot instantly replace massive shipping routes overnight. And you cannot easily rebuild stable energy flows once geopolitical conflict escalates. So governments and central banks become trapped in a deeply uncomfortable position. Inflation rises while economic growth simultaneously slows down. Economists call this stagflation, one of the most feared economic environments because it combines rising prices with weakening economic activity. That combination can become incredibly painful for ordinary people. Consumers already struggling with higher living costs suddenly face even more pressure. Fuel prices rise. Airline tickets rise. Food prices rise. Electricity costs rise. Shipping surcharges appear everywhere. Companies facing higher operating expenses begin passing costs directly to customers. Businesses with weak profit margins begin struggling to survive. Consumers reduce spending because daily essentials consume more of their income. Economic growth starts weakening. Confidence declines. Hiring slows. Investment slows. Financial markets become volatile. Fear spreads through the economy. And history shows that energy crises often create psychological panic far beyond the actual shortage itself. Markets react not just to current disruptions but to uncertainty about what happens next. Investors begin imagining worst-case scenarios. What if the conflict spreads? What if shipping insurance costs explode? What if additional choke points become unstable? What if governments begin begin restricting exports. Suddenly speculation and fear amplify the original problem dramatically. This is one reason why experts are so alarmed by the Strait of Hormuz scenario. It's not merely about one shipping lane. It's about confidence in the stability of the global economic system itself. Modern globalization depends on reliable movement of goods and energy across oceans. The entire financial system is built around assumptions of relatively stable trade flows. Once those assumptions weaken, markets become extremely sensitive. And perhaps the most frightening part is how quickly the ripple effects spread beyond energy itself. Fertilizer prices, for example, become a massive issue because fertilizer production relies heavily on natural gas. When energy prices spike, fertilizer becomes dramatically more expensive. Farmers face rising costs. Agricultural production becomes more expensive globally. Food inflation begins accelerating. Suddenly families on the other side of the world begin paying more for groceries because of instability thousands of miles away. Shipping markets also react aggressively. Freight rates surge as insurance costs rise and shipping routes become more dangerous or inefficient. Companies begin rerouting cargo through longer paths. Delays spread through supply chains. Delivery times increase. Businesses dependent on just-in-time logistics suddenly face operational chaos. And because modern economies are deeply interconnected, even small disruptions can trigger surprisingly large consequences. Airlines become another major casualty. Jet fuel costs rise sharply during oil shocks, crushing profitability for airlines already operating within margins. Analysts begin revising earnings downward. Investors panic about travel demand weakening as ticket prices increase. Tourism-dependent economies start feeling pressure. Once again, the effects spread far beyond the original geopolitical conflict itself. And this is exactly why institutions like the IMF and major macroeconomic forecasters become deeply concerned during prolonged energy disruptions. They understand that recessions often emerge not from one single catastrophic event but from chains of pressure building simultaneously throughout the system. Rising inflation weakens consumers. Higher costs weaken businesses. Falling confidence weakens investment. Slowing growth pressures employment. Financial markets react negatively. Credit conditions tighten. Eventually the entire economy begins slowing under the combined weight of these interconnected forces. What makes this environment especially difficult is that policymakers often have no easy solutions. If central banks raise interest rates aggressively to fight inflation, they risk pushing economies deeper into recession. But if they avoid tightening policy, inflation may spiral further. Governments can attempt subsidies or emergency energy measures, but those policies become expensive and politically difficult. Every solution creates new trade-offs. And during periods like this, investor psychology changes dramatically. During stable economic periods, markets often reward growth, optimism, and risk-taking. But during inflationary crises and economic uncertainty, investors begin prioritizing resilience instead. Suddenly people start asking completely different questions about businesses. Can this company survive rising costs? Can it maintain profits during inflation? Does it require massive amounts of capital just to continue operating? Or does it possess pricing power strong enough to pass higher costs directly on to customers? This is where Warren Buffett's famous ideas about inflation become incredibly relevant. Decades ago, Buffett warned that inflation acts almost like a hidden tax on businesses. Some companies survive inflation extremely well because they require little additional capital and possess strong pricing power. Others become trapped because they constantly need to reinvest enormous amounts of money simply to maintain operations. Imagine two businesses. One company sells a product so valuable and differentiated that customers willingly accept price increases. The business itself requires relatively little capital investment to continue operating. Even during inflation, profits remain strong because the company adapts easily. Now imagine another business dependent on constant heavy reinvestment. It requires expensive machinery, expensive fuel, expensive logistics, expensive maintenance, and continuous capital spending just to survive. Inflation becomes devastating because operating costs rise faster than the company can adjust. That distinction matters enormously during economic turbulence. Buffett's insight was that inflation quietly reshapes the business landscape by rewarding efficiency, pricing power, and adaptability while punishing capital intensity and weak margins. And during major energy disruptions, those differences become amplified dramatically. This is why periods of economic instability often create both enormous destruction and enormous opportunity simultaneously. Weak businesses struggle. Over-leveraged companies face pressure. Fragile systems crack under stress. But resilient businesses with strong balance sheets, pricing power, and efficient operations can emerge even stronger than before. The challenge for investors is psychological. During calm periods, people often ignore risk because stability feels permanent. Markets rise. Energy flows smoothly. Inflation stays manageable. Globalization appears unstable. unstoppable. People assume the system will continue functioning exactly as it always has, until suddenly it doesn't. That's the uncomfortable lesson history teaches repeatedly. Modern civilization is incredibly advanced, but it is also deeply dependent on fragile systems operating continuously without interruption. A narrow waterway on the other side of the world can suddenly influence the price of food, airline tickets, electricity, manufacturing, and transportation across entire continents. And once fear enters financial markets, reactions can become extreme. Investors rush toward safety. Commodity prices surge. Volatility explodes. Governments scramble for solutions. Media coverage intensifies panic. Consumers begin changing behavior. Businesses delay investments. Confidence weakens. Economic momentum slows. That's why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. Not because it's merely a geographic location, but because it represents one of the critical pressure points holding together the modern global economy. It's a reminder that globalization created extraordinary efficiency, but also extraordinary interconnectedness. And interconnected systems can become surprisingly vulnerable when one major component fails. The world economy has always depended on confidence. Confidence that ships will move. Confidence that energy will flow. Confidence that markets will remain stable. Confidence that tomorrow's systems will function similarly to today's. Once that confidence weakens, the effects spread far beyond the original disruption itself. And maybe that's the deeper warning hidden inside this entire situation. The greatest risks to the global economy are often the ones people barely think about during stable times. Invisible systems, hidden dependencies, fragile assumptions. Most people never think about shipping lanes or LNG exports or fertilizer production or overnight energy flows. But those systems quietly support modern life every single day, until suddenly everyone is forced to notice them at once. And if the Strait of Hormuz crisis truly escalated into a prolonged disruption, the consequences could reshape inflation, global growth, financial markets, business profitability, and investor psychology for years to come. Because when the foundation beneath the global economy starts shaking, the ripple effects don't stay contained. They spread everywhere.